As we switch over to our message here, I remember I was on a flight, and on this flight, back when we could actually travel, that is, I remember I was watching an maybe average, maybe less than average romantic comedy. It was nowhere near in the caliber of a How to Lose a Guy in 10 Days or a You've Got Mail. But in this particular romantic comedy, the premise is that the main character, she has just graduated college and she's in an interview for her first job after school. And she's prepared for this interview. She was a finance major. She knows her stuff. She's ready for the questions about finance or about the financial world. But that's not the question that her interviewer asks her. Her interviewer asks her a question that is in a very different light. And the question that the interviewer asked her was this. It was, who is Jenny? Who is Jenny? And after the question, she was tongue-tied. It was not the question she anticipated, and even more, it was not a question that she knew how to answer. And I think when we think about that question, who is Matt? Who is Brendan? Who is Luke? Who is Joan? Who are you? Who am I? It's a really hard question to answer, right? If you have the question instead, like what's your story? I feel like it's like a question maybe that might give us anxiety as we try just by sharing a few parts of our life, a few pieces of our story, as we try to answer this question of who we are. But still, like who am I? What is my story? Is a question that I know how to answer, or a question of what do I do? I know how to answer that one. But in answering who am I, I could talk for a whole hour, and I wouldn't even be sure by the end of it if I ever even answered the question, who am I? Answering the question, who am I, it feels a lot like throwing darts in the dark, and you're not sure if you hit bullseye, even let alone if you even hit the target at all. And so who am I is a really hard question for us to answer. It's a question that philosophers would call an existential question. One that kind of will lead into a crisis or even an angst or fear or anxiety for us. And so right now we are continuing on in our series we're calling Songs of Great Joy, where we're looking at 5 songs of the next 5 weeks about Jesus' birth in the Gospel of Luke. 5 songs that are responding to the news of Jesus' birth. And the song that we looked at last week that Luke preached on was looking at the song of Mary as she responds to the news that she's going to be the mother of Jesus, her Lord. And today we're going to look at Zechariah's song. And the song that he is singing is in response to someone asking him a who am I type question. But more specifically, the question he is being asked is, who will your son be? And so here's what I want to do today. First, we want to look at the context. Really want us to understand why Zechariah is being asking this, or why Zechariah is being asked this question, who is your son? Who am I? This type of question. And then second, we're going to look at the content of his answer. Because in the content of his answer, there's a really important lesson in who we ultimately are, as well as why that question is so hard for us to answer. So again, we're going to start with the context to understand why Zechariah is being asked this who am I question, and then we're going to look at the content of his answer. So let's start here with the context of his question. So Lauren, she is a big fan of the show, The Bachelorette, and when she really twists my arm, I'll watch it with her. Okay, to be honest, actually I do enjoy watching the show. And one of the iconic lines in the show, this is one of the lines that Chris Harrison, the host of the show, says all the time, is that this season is the most dramatic season of The Bachelor yet. They've had, I think, around 20 seasons, and each season he somehow continues to say that line. And the show is advertised about being a show about love, but what really drives the show isn't love. What really drives the show is drama. And so each season, there's at least 1 or 2 moments that are really dramatic moments that are really driving the entire show forward. But in our story today, it doesn't have just 1 or 2 dramatic moments. It doesn't have 3 or 4 dramatic moments. It has at least 5 dramatic moments that are really driving Zechariah's story forward, that are leading everyone around Zechariah to be asking the same exact question: who will your son be? So let's take a look at those 5 dramatic moments here to start as we look at the context. And the first one is this: Zechariah was selected to burn incense in the temple. And so in Zechariah's day, there were about 18,000 priests. And each week, the high point of the week was that one person would go into the most holy place, which was second only to the Holy of Holies, where a priest would enter only one time a year. But 52 times each year, once a week, one person out of these 18,000 priests was selected to enter into the most holy place and burn incense. And so on this particular occasion, Zechariah was selected. And afterwards, when he would travel and head home after his week of service, him just being selected, this was more than a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. This was something that would be even rare for any priest to ever have the opportunity to do. And so in Zechariah's hometown, when he went back home, where there's not really a whole lot going on, hearing that Zechariah had been selected to burn incense in the most holy place, that kind of would have made him a big man on campus. Like, I could imagine when Zechariah went home that there would be hushed tones as his neighbors spoke around each other when Zechariah came around, as they said, "Hey, is that Zechariah? Yeah. Did you hear that Zechariah got to burn incense in the temple?" Yes. Like, I could hear hushed tones as Zechariah would enter, because this was a dramatic moment, him getting to burn incense in the very presence of God. But if that was enough to raise eyebrows and have his neighbors turn towards him, what happened next would have for sure made him the talk of the town. And so the next dramatic thing that happened to Zechariah was that when he left the temple, he left mute and deaf. So Zechariah, he was living during these 400 years in between the last prophet that spoke through God to where, the birth of Jesus, the next time Jesus would speak, or the next time God would speak. And during this time, that's just to give a frame of reference, that's like almost twice the length that America has been a country or been a nation. That's the length of time that had gone since God had last spoken through his people, or to his people. And so when Zechariah enters the temple, that is the next time that God speaks. And God speaks through the angel Gabriel, who, when Zechariah enters the temple, he's expecting it to be, alone in this area, but instead there's this angel there, Gabriel, who tells him that he will have a son. And Zechariah, because he's old, he has a hard time believing this, so he doesn't act in faith. And so as a consequence, this angel tells him that Zechariah is going to be mute and deaf. And so just imagine for yourself, like, being in that small town where, again, there's no 24-hour news cycle. And you hear that Zechariah not only got a chance to burn incense in the most holy place, that he was selected for that, but that even more, that when he came out, like, something strange must have happened to him when he was inside the temple, because when he came out, he was deaf and mute. I'm sorry, but would there be anything else to talk about in that town? I feel like everyone and their mother would be talking about Zechariah at that point. But even then, the drama was just starting, because what would happen next would have completely shocked his neighbors. So after returning home, this is the third piece of drama, after returning home, Zechariah's wife, Elizabeth, became pregnant. And the text tells us that Zechariah was advanced in years, meaning he was old, and so was his wife. And so they had never been able to have children. But when she becomes pregnant, the text tells us that she remained in seclusion for 6 months. And I think you can totally see why. Because when the neighbors, after 6 months of seclusion, after seeing Elizabeth with her big old pregnant belly, I feel like their jaws must have dropped. Because after everything that had happened on top of that, now the icing on the cake is that this old woman is somehow miraculously pregnant. Again, like, what else would there be to talk about at the dinner table than Zechariah and his wife? So that was the third piece of drama. But here's the fourth, is that Zechariah named his son John. I know. They named him John, right? Like, who in the family was named John? No one. That's who. And so, you would think that Zechariah and his wife, that after everything that had happened to them, that they really would want to play it low when it came time to name their child. That they wouldn't want to do anything that would go against, the customs of their day. But when it came time to name the child, like they threw all custom to the wind and named him John. And the neighbors, they had a hard time believing that this is what really wanted to name the child. And so, they gave a writing tablet to silent Zach, and they said to him, like, is this really what you want to name your child? And Zechariah on the writing tablet wrote, his name is John, because that was the name that the angel told Zechariah to name his child. And what happens next is recorded in chapter 1 of Luke, verse 64. So you can follow along with me on the screen or in your Bibles. Again, Luke chapter 1, verse 64. What happens next is immediately his mouth, meaning Zechariah's mouth, was opened and his tongue set free. And he began to speak, praising God. And all the neighbors were filled with awe. And throughout the hill country of Judea, people were talking about these things. Again, Zechariah was the talk of the town. And if we were there too, we'd be talking all the same. Everyone who heard this wondered about it, asking, what then is this child going to be? For the Lord's hand was with him. So that's why everyone was asking the question, who is this child going to be? And it was literally the question on the tip of everyone's tongue because of all the dramatic events that had been happening in and around Zechariah and his wife. It was so much so that everyone knew that this child was destined for greatness. And so again, the question on the tip of everyone's tongue was, who is this child going to be? So that's the context. Everyone has this burning question of who will this child be, but what about the content of Zechariah's answer? Well, let's look at that now. And so remember, as we're looking at the content of this answer, we're going to discover something ultimately about who we are, as well as why that question, who am I, is so difficult for us to answer. So let me read the first stanza in Zechariah's song in response to the question, who will your son be? Verse 67, Zechariah, his father was filled with the Holy Spirit and prophesied, praise be the Lord, the God of Israel, because he has come to his people and redeemed them. He has raised up a horn of salvation for us in the house of his servant David. And by horn here, think bull horn or the horn of a bull, which was a symbol of might. And so, but by saying this, Zechariah was saying that God's son Jesus was going to be a mighty king. Verse 70. As he said through his prophets of long ago, salvation from our enemies and from the hand of all who hate us, to show mercy to our God and to show mercy to our ancestors and to remember his holy covenant, the oath he swore to our father Abraham, to rescue us from the hand of our enemies and to enable us to serve him without fear, in holiness and righteousness, before him all of our days. So when everyone was asking the question, who will your son be? Zechariah, at first glance, it kind of seems like he gives that answer of a politician. The answer where a politician is asked a very specific question, and then after, when you listen to his or her answer, you think to yourself, did they say anything about the answer whatsoever? Anything about the question whatsoever? And so Zechariah, when he's asked the question, who will your son be? He answers to the question, who will God's son be? And that's the fifth piece of drama in this story, is that when everyone is asking Zechariah, who will your son be? He begins by answering, who will God's son be? So why does he answer this way? Why does he begin his answer to who his son will be by answering, who will God's son be? Well, let me answer that for us in a roundabout way. So I started our message today with the example of this movie, this very average rom-com where the last time we saw our heroine, she is in an interview and she's being asked the question, who is Jenny? And after that question, she's totally tongue-tied and doesn't know how to answer it. And so what happens next is that she leaves the interview right away and she goes off to discover who she is. And how do people typically today go to find that answer of who am I? How do people go to find the answer to who they are? We travel. I think there's a whole genre of memoirs right now of people discovering who they are through travel. So we travel, we go and have new experiences, we try new adventures, we try new challenges or try to accomplish new things. And I think, the reason why this is like the main way we try to discover who we are is because, at the bottom of our souls, we all sense that we were made for something bigger than ourselves. We all have this sense that the answer to who I am is not going to be found inward inside of me, but the answer of who I am is something I have to discover by looking outwards rather than inwards. And so when we seek to answer this question by looking outwards, we're definitely in the right direction, we're on the right path, but alone, it's never going to be enough to answer the question who we are. No experience, no trip, no travel plans, no accomplishment, no person can ever fully sufficiently tell you who you are. And the reason for that is because they're all created things just like you and me. And if we're gonna know who we are, we need to ask the one who created us. Because it's only the one who created us that can tell us why we were created. Only the Creator can tell you why He made you. And so that's what Zechariah is doing here, is he's pointing his son to the Creator to tell him why he was made. And we see a really important clue to this of both why John was made and why we were made in verse 74, where Zechariah says, Jesus will enable us to serve Him, meaning God, without fear and holiness and righteousness before Him all our days. That is who you are. That is who you were created to be. You were created to serve God without fear and to be in His presence all of your days. At the end of the day, that's who you are. That's who you're created to be. You're created by God to serve Him and to be with Him, to enjoy Him without fear, to be in His presence and to enjoy Him all of your days. That's who you were created to be, and that's who I was created to be. And yet that's also where our problem arises. Because I don't know about you, but I can't go one day of living a life serving God in holiness and righteousness. I can't go one day even serving Lauren or Asher when I don't serve them from a place of fear or self-interest or insecurity or any of those kind of things. I'm always going to be serving them from a place of insecurity or pride or one of those things. And so, if I can't even serve them from one single day of not moving from a place that's not from love, how am I ever going to be able to serve God endlessly from a place of righteousness and holiness? I can't. And I think that's really important here. I think that's a really important clue to why it's so hard for us to answer the question, who am I? Who is Matt? Who are you? And I think it's because we all feel, we all have this feeling intuitively deep down within our souls that there's this disconnect between who I'm supposed to be, or who God has created to be, me to be, and who I am. Don't you feel that disconnect? I totally feel the disconnect of who God has created us to be, or maybe you're not sure about God, but who you think you ought to be and who you are. I think for all of us, there's this giant disconnect between us there. And it's because we've been created to serve this God in holiness and in righteousness, and yet we all know deep down inside that we are not worthy to stand in the presence of God. We are not able to stand in His presence because we are all flawed human beings who have turned away from Him. But also, I just want you to see in this verse that there's also a reason for great hope. So let's look at verse 74 one more time. It says, Jesus will enable us to serve Him without fear and holiness and righteousness before Him all of our days. And so Jesus knows this. He knows that you cannot serve God in holiness and righteousness. He knows that we do not have the capacity to do this. And so the beauty of this verse is that it tells us that Jesus will enable us. He will enable us to serve God. He will enable us to stand in the very presence of God for all of our days, and for that to be never taken away from us. And that right there is the good news of Christmas. That Jesus came, that God sent His Son so that you could be who God created you to be. Isn't that the good news of Christmas right there? That God sent His Son into the world so that you could be the person that God created you to be. And it's only in Jesus that this disconnect that we have can vanish. And that's why John points his son to who God's son will be before he can answer who his son will be. But in pointing his son to who God's son will be, now he can begin to answer who his son will be as well in him. Check out verse 76 with me. It reads, "And you, my child," this is speaking of John, "and you, my child, will be called a prophet of the Most High, for you will go on before the Lord to prepare the way for him, to give his people the knowledge of salvation, the forgiveness of their sins, because of the tender mercy of our God, by which the rising sun will come to us from heaven, to shine on those living in darkness and in the shadow of death, to guide our feet into the path of peace." So who is John? John, like you and me, is a servant of God. And John was also uniquely tasked to prepare the way for God, to prepare the way for God's Son to come to earth. But you might be asking yourselves, well, Jesus has already come. Like John has already prepared the way, and then Jesus came after him. So, where does that leave for me to do? Like, what's my unique role? Like, what's my purpose? Like, why has God specifically created me? And again, I want to point you back to verse 74, because I think it's such a critical verse for us to understand, and knowing our identity of who we are and who God has created us to be. Verse 74 again says, "Jesus will enable us to serve him without fear, in holiness and righteousness before him all of our days." And so your task is this. Your task is to enjoy God. That's why Jesus came. He came so that you could be enabled to enjoy God, so you could serve him, so you could stand in the very presence of God as a servant and to enjoy God without fear for all of your days. Again, that's the good news of Christmas, that God sent his Son into this world to enable you to become the person that God created you to be. And Jesus, it says in verse 79 that he came to those living in darkness to illuminate the path of peace. And isn't that the thing that we all want? To be at peace with God, to be at peace with our neighbors, and even to be at peace with ourselves. It's sad, but it's true that like the holidays are some of the most stressful, the most anxious, the most depressing times for people today. That those are the times where all too often we are experiencing that seasonal depression. Isn't that like the moment that we want to experience the peace we were created for? The peace that God wants us to have? It says that that's why Jesus came. And so as we lean into this reality of like who we are, as you lean into the reality of who God has created you to be, the promise is that you will experience peace. You will experience rest as you lean into that reality of who God has created you to be, a servant to enjoy him. And yet, Satan's oldest trick, the one that he keeps playing on repeat, is that he wants to convince you that to find the answer to the question of who you are, that you need to look beyond God. Satan, he truly wants to convince you that for you to answer the question of who you are, you have to look to other things beyond God, that to answer it in God alone is not enough. Satan wants you to answer that question in what you do. He wants you to answer the question of who you are in the things that you accomplish or in comparing yourself to others. And yet, just like our forefathers and foremothers, like when they sought to find the answer of who they were outside of God, they didn't find peace. They didn't find the ultimate answer to who they were. They lost it. They came into a place where they were in anxiety with one another, where they were not in peace with God, not in peace with one another or their neighbor, and not at peace with themselves. And the reason is because the answer to who you are has always and is always meant to be found in God alone. And the good news of Christmas is as you seek to find the answer to who you are in God, as you realize your identity, that you were created to serve God and to be with him, as you live into the peace of that reality, you will both know who you are in a secure and stable way, but you will also find the peace for why God sent his Son. That God sent his son into the world. This is the good news of Christmas, so that Jesus could enable you to become the person that God created you to be. That's the good news of Christmas. And so as we close here today, I want us to close by hearing the entirety of this song. Because there's something about knowing the background of the song, knowing its context, and knowing the content of a song, knowing its message, that makes songs so much richer for us to hear. That makes it so much more meaningful, that makes them resonate so much more deeply within our hearts and spirits. And so, who better to play the background music of our song for us today than the two cellos? And they have a song called Benedictus, which is the background music. And Benedictus is the Latin word for the first phrase of Zechariah's song, which is, God is to be praised. And so that's what the Latin word means. It's the Benedictus. It's the first line of Zechariah's song. And so right now we're going to play the first line and the entire song of Zechariah's song. We hope you enjoy it.
His father Zechariah was filled with the Holy Spirit and prophesied.
It's coming.
Praise be to the Lord, the God of Israel, because he has come to his people and redeemed them. He has raised up a horn of salvation for us in the house of his servant David, as he said through his holy prophets of long ago, salvation from our enemies and from the hand of all who hate us, to show mercy to our ancestors and to remember his holy covenant, the oath he swore to our father Abraham, to rescue us from the hand of our enemies and to enable us to serve him without fear, in holiness and righteousness, before him all our days. And you, my child, will be called a prophet of the Most High. For you will go on before the Lord to prepare the way for him, to give his people the knowledge of salvation through the forgiveness of their sins, because of the tender mercy of our God, by which the rising sun will come to us from heaven, to shine on those living in darkness and in the shadow of death, to guide our feet into the path of peace.